Now, our high-level talk session will focus on something very important as our society becomes ever more reliant on science and technology, the ethics and the responsibility of scientists. Our panelists are Yoshikawa Hiroyuki, a member of the Japan Academy, and Ulrike Felt, president of the European Association for the Study of Science and Technology. In Japan, the only country that has experienced the horror of nuclear weapons, many people tend to focus on the inhumane side of physics and the responsibility of physicists to operate ethically. But in Europe, conversations about the need for scientists to behave responsibly have centered on environmental issues since the 1970s. This session will explore the responsibility scientists have to work in support of humanity, including the topic of responsible research and innovation, or RRI, in the 21st century. Now, let me introduce the moderator of this session. She is Fujigaki Yuko, Executive Vice President and Professor in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Tokyo. So, Ms. Fujigaki, what an important topic to discuss about. The floor is yours.
Let us begin the high-level talk session on science and humanity. First, I will show you an introduction of this session. Science and humanity is a very important issue when we consider about science and human mind, the main theme of this year's Tokyo Forum. The next slide, please. This slide explains the meaning of humanity and humanities. Humanity has two meanings. One is human being generally. The second meaning is the quality of being humane or human. The second point is so important when we consider the science and humanity, since this kind of meaning can focus on the responsibility of science and responsibility of scientists. The plural words humanities means studies such as ancient and modern literature, history, and so on. The next slide, please. This is the picture of 6th First Pugwash Conference held in Nagasaki in 2015. As you know, the Pugwash Conference was established in 1957 based on the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which insists on the huge risk of nuclear weapons and peaceful use of science and technology. In the manifest, they said, remember your humanity and forget the rest. You can find the word remember your humanity as the main theme of 61st Pugwash Conference in this slide, in the second line. In this talk session, we first invite ex-president of the University of Tokyo, Hiroyuki Yoshikawa, who had the presentation in Nagasaki conference. He will talk about meaning of remember your humanity, based on his deep insights, which is expected to give us the starting point to think about science and humanity. The next slide, please. As you have seen in the Pugwash Conference discussion, science and humanity is mainly discussed when we consider the evil effects or side effects of science and technology. At the same time, we should discuss about science and humanity when we should coexist with new technology. This slide explains about several issues in which human being has faced problems and struggled on how to manage problems to coexist with new technology. For example, in 1970s, environment issues caused by chemical engineering waste were discussed. In 1990s, BSE scandal happens mainly in UK, and in 2000s, controversies on GMO, genetically modified organization, nanotechnology, and global climate change evoked These are discussions on science and humanity focused on issues how human being coexists with new technology. The next slide, please. This slide explains several concepts when we deal with issues how human being coexists with new technology. One stream is concept of ELSI, ethical, legal, and social implications. ELSI in United States and ELSA in Europe. ELSI funding, studied by the statement by James Watson, the Nobel Prize winner, by finding the double helix of DNA structure. He stated that ELSI research should be done using the national funds for the Human Genome Project. The other stream is upstream public engagement. The concept of RRI, responsible research and innovation, appeared in Horizon 2020 in European Science and Technology Policy, is used as a node to orchestrate these discussions. The next slide, please. This is the last slide. RRI, responsible research and innovation, was included in Horizon 2020 as one of the key concepts of the research and innovation policy in the European Union. RRI implies that societal actors such as researchers, citizens, policymakers, business, third sector organizations, etc., work together during the whole research and innovation process. We invite Professor Feld in University Vienna, who knows very well about RRI discussion. Through the discussion between Professor Yoshikawa and Professor Feld, we can understand wide range of consideration on science and humanity. Okay, so let us start. The first point is the meaning of Remember Your Humanity in Pugwash Conference. Professor Yoshikawa, you have been played as the chair of the advisory board of Japan Pugwash Conference, and you also had a nice presentation in Nagasaki Conference. So will you please explain about the meaning of Remember Your Humanity based on your presentation? Please.
Thank you. The most difficult question has been given to me. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. In the Pugwash conference, Russell-Einstein Declaration, that was the basis for the Pugwash conference, mentioned this at the end. And that was already explained. And the humanity means humankind. So the spirit that you should have as a human being, that is humanity. And the humanities is an academic field, non-scientific studies. So what does it mean, remember your humanity? So it's humanity and forget the rest. So forget everything else. So in the Russell-Einstein Declaration, what it says is that, the horror of atomic bombs, that they should not be made. Well, actually, they don't talk about the atomic weapons in that declaration. Rather, they focus on war. It was 1955 that it was written, so it was after World War II had ended, 10 years had passed. What happened at that time was the hydrogen bomb was created, and compared with the A-bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it was 1,000 times powerful. And so the scientists who knew most about those technologies wrote the manifesto. So those were people in chemistry and physics who won Nobel Prizes.
The threat of the atomic bomb, knowing how horror it is, the fact that it is well known, those people have to disseminate those messages. So that is the gist of this message. And that people tend to prone to get into war. And of course, war is nothing good. But in the history, we have gone through multiple phases of battle and war. So maybe weapons. It is sort of a given that through the war and battles, some lives are lost. But that is the past. So at the moment, if we are to engage in a war, a stronger weapon will be created. And the hydrogen bomb, maybe a more powerful bomb. It is a competition in coming up with a strong ammunition. And then getting into a war, all our planet will be lost. All of the humans on the planet will be lost. So as a scientist, it is very difficult to verify that. But because we know as being a scientist, in terms of remember your humanity, what does this mean? So humanity is cross-border, regardless of which nationality you are. It's for all humankind. So we are all allies. So therefore, we should abandon engaging into war. So that is the gist of that. But that's too simple. So the humanities, there are vicious humanities. So that's also something that is not clear. So I had a different interpretation of this. The word remember. This word remember is so important because it is not the reality. It's not think the reality. It's not think, but remember. So remember meaning the past. You need to reflect upon the past. Remember is not reality, it's a concept. So reflective of the past and looking at the lineage of the history, human has always been wanting to be pacifist. In Greek, the philosophers, they have an eloquent speech contest, and they are going to compete by being eloquent, not being engaging into war, so in rhetoric. So we are now following the history, like Utopia, Thomas More. In 15, it's a novel, and that's a utopia world being written in his book. And this is just a utopia, but he had written in literature, but this could not be realized in 17th century. With the, of course, advent of science. Francis Bacon, The New Atlantis, the book that was written. And what this is all about is science. Those people who are versed in science are going to be gathered to one location, and a very stable, of course, world is being created. And there is no conflict there. It's a story that unfolds with this narrative. So big philosophers, how humans can really be peaceful. We have been following that. And we need to remember that. That's the word remember. So in 19th century, or maybe 18th century, Kant, in terms of the book of pure sacrifice, that human can think rhetorically in terms of the critique of pure reason. So, of course, there are many things. It is a practical reasoning, and the practical reasoning is, so in Newton, in science, is quite different dimension. It could not unify humans. So we have to think in this very detail, the Kant. And ultimately, the human have a ethics and morale. So that's something that could not be verified like science. But each one of us, all of us, if we believe in that, then that formula is going to be right. So that is not easy. So Kant, in the critique of the reason, the perpetual peace is another book that he had written. So how we be able to avoid war? And he said that he has been able to write that in a very rational way. And he said that the theory is an agreement between philosophers. We do not know how this could be interpreted by the politicians. So he have confessed that politicians were not involved in this talk. So this is something that could not be solved. But Greek, not only Europe, but in Japan, well, engaging in war. So in unifying the nation, we said that we are going to abandon war, the civil strife that is. That is the Edo era in Japan. In the Edo era, Japan decided to close our nation to seek peace, and we were able to do so. But a similar thing was happening in Japan as well. The Edo, which has seen a flourish of culture, it is wonderful in itself. But you're the human around the world, the humanity part that I'm talking about, and what is being done, and remembering what had happened. So why is it so that we have to abandon war? We will be able to come up with a principle. So that is how I would like to unfold the remember your humanity and forget the rest. There are many things in peripheral, but basically we need to forget the rest. So this is really is a word, a reflective of human's history, what we have exerted effort on, what difficulties we have gone through, what ordeals we confronted. So the Russell Einstein manifest has concluded with this word, remember your humanity and forget the rest. So this, I believe, have interpreted this word, I believe.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you, Professor Yoshikawa, for answering your insightful answer to the very, very difficult question. In Japan, people incline to think about responsibility of physicists when we consider responsibility of scientists focusing on inhumane nature of atomic bombs, since Japan is the only country that has experienced nuclear bombing. So let us move to the third question, Uli, background of concept of Ararai. As I explained in my introduction slides, responsibility of scientists in Europe has been discussed about not only atomic bombs, but also other issues such as environmental issues, BSE, GMO, and nanotechnology. Professor Felt, will you please explain about the background of concept of Ararai?
So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you, and a warm welcome from Vienna. Let me shortly outline this background of how and why responsible research and innovation became part of, as you said, of the Horizon 2020 funding program of the European Union. And it's always, because we spoke already about history, it's always interesting to root these concepts in the history of a development. And there in Europe, it's interesting because on the one hand, we have also the precautionary principle that was very important in the European context, which is a principle that enables decision makers to adopt measures when scientific evidence about an environmental or a human health hazard is uncertain and the stakes are very high. And that is very interesting because precaution means that we can act even before we have this kind of definite proof that harm will be done, but sufficiently uncertainty. And I think this is part of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union and is very important in that sense. On the other hand, as you said already, RRI has this ELSI or ELSA, as we call it in Europe, so ethical, legal, and social aspects dimension. That it was since the 1990s part of the programs, but here we also see the history of the place, namely, it was more focused on the life sciences and medicine. And this has also to do with the way the war history worked in Europe, namely the way how under National Socialism, medicine played a very kind of unacceptable role in mistreating humans and in ignoring any form of humanity, if you want so. So in that sense, and then we have also the movement towards more participation. And there was a certain critique there for this ELSA approach, namely to say that it would not cover the full spectrum of social impacts that come with major scientific and technological changes, that it was not enough forward-looking, not enough inclusive, and not carefully investigating the distributive consequences of innovation. And in that sense, here RRI came in, and RRI from the very beginning underlined that it was more proactive, and it was expected to allow for both the avoidance or at least the kind of recognition of unintended consequences of an innovation. And it was the movement from governance that was reactive, so acting if something has happened, or it was forward-looking. So in short, we move away from a simple reflection on technoscientific developments to allowing societal actors to participate actually in the development of innovation, which would then, at the end of the day, be better aligned with societal futures which citizens might feel that are worth attaining. And as Professor Fujikake already outlined in her introduction, RRI was defined as this kind of more transparent, interactive process by which societal actors and innovators would be able to engage with each other. And the aim was to come up with ethically acceptable, but also sustainable and societally desirable innovations. And this is a move away from solely allowing the market, if you want so, as a societal actor to decide whether or not we innovate in a certain directions and what improvements we should go, and instead to have a more careful process of deliberation, including citizens and civil society actors who should decide on the value and direction of innovation. And analysts then specified RRI as being characterized by 4 different kinds of qualities and activities: anticipation, reflexivity, inclusion, and responsiveness. And anticipation refers here to systematic thinking of the many different potential outcomes of innovation, while always admitting our limited foresight capacities. So to be humble about what we can do. Reflexivity means critically questioning the ways problems and solutions are framed. So how do we think about problems and what do we want to solve? And inclusion then draws our attention to questions of power and who is or is not given voice. And finally, responsiveness highlights the need to adjust all along the process. So to be a learning society. And together they are supposed to support better and more inclusive, and in the end, maybe more sustainable development when it comes to science and technology in a society which is so much kind of guided by these principles.
Okay, thank you. So let us move on to the 4th question: similarities and differences between RRI and responsibility of atomic bombs. So, Professor Yoshikawa, how do you think about similarities and differences between RRI and responsibility of atomic bombs?
It's a difficult issue, I think. So, as Professor Feld said, on many occasions, the harmful outcomes for humans can come out of science and technology. The atomic bomb is the ultimate example, but there are many others that's starting to become clear. So concerning innovation, you always have to think about that. And so you have to have the participation of the civil society. That's the context. And to further strengthen Professor Feld's thought is that threat to humankind can be categorized into three. One, well, when the humans came out of the savannah, well, they faced natural threats like earthquakes, typhoon, and floods. And the humans have overcome each of these threats one by one. I don't know if I should say this, but that has led to humankind ruling the world. So we have come to this state, so we have affluent and safe lifestyle. And we owe it to science for achieving that. So natural threats still continue. And there are many things we don't know, like we see that the floods are increasing in recent years. And so to protect our safety, we have construction codes and civil engineering codes, but those codes now have to be revised. So there's so much that has to continue to be done concerning natural threats. Second, anthroponic threats. So threats from science, inventing something new that can sometimes lead to very good things. But the global warming is something that the science and technology has caused. And the third is war. And this is some very bad thing that comes out, an evil thing that comes out of conflict amongst the people. So you look at these three things separately. And RRI, I think, is very broad, can cover all those areas. Especially the anthropogenic threat, starting from the bio area. So the more scientific power people have, the more innovation you have, and that achieves the short-term goals. But when you have a combination of several innovations that can lead to harmful effects, global warming being a very good example. But we can be confident that, well, we can be proud that humankind is confronting global warming. The researcher Jan Fulier said that there's warming. Our news said there's more carbon gas, the global temperature rose, and that other researcher was in Sweden and said that the fuel cost will decline. But in 1970s, it became clear that if global warming should continue, and if human activity becomes more active, there will be more global warming. And in the near future, we will be like 400 degrees. No living organism can live. And so it would be as frightening as an A-bomb or H-bomb. And so the A-bomb was considered to be responsibility of the physicists and the science. But now we have a lot of knowledge, which is good, and the way you use knowledge is the problem, is what's been proposed. So we've been saying that. And there was hundreds of papers in the 1970s about global warming. People didn't listen, and in 1985, in Austria, Chilaha, there was a conference attended not just by scientists, but also politicians, administrators, talking about the threat of global warming to raise a voice. and that was delivered to the UN, and that led to the Rio Summit in 1992, and the Framework Convention for Climate Change was introduced. And so there were COPs in various countries. The 26th was held recently, and the Kyoto Protocol was made, and the Paris Accord was made recently. And so humankind now able to work together to confront that. And it's not often talked about who played a major role. Well, tens of thousands of scientists in various fields agreed to work together to create that movement. So it's not just the physicists, but all kinds of people, all kinds of scientists agreed and worked on that. And so that leads to the concept of RRI. So global warming is as frightening as an atom bomb, but it is an issue that's connected to all innovation. And so what should scientists do? It was the problem that all scientists were forced to think about, and what should academies do? It's a very big responsibility of the academy on this matter, and it's very different from when the atomic bomb was dropped.
Okay, thank you. So let us move on to the fifth question, the role of social science and humanities in consideration of the effect of science and technology to society. Professor Felt, I often hear from my colleagues in natural science and engineering that in European Union, project funding places greater emphasis on SSH, social science and humanities, than in Japan. Will you please explain about the role of social science and humanities in consideration of the effect of science and technologies to society?
That's a very good question, actually, because it is essential to reflect the broader cultural context. And I think Professor Yoshikawa has pointed to the fact that the focus that has been put on physics in the Japanese context has, of course, to do with the event of the atomic bomb being dropped on the territory and this unique experience. Now, in Europe, the history has been a very different one. And if we speak of Europe, we speak actually of very different nation states that had very different histories and also different imaginations of what is a good life and where do we want to develop towards, etc. And I think that has led to the fact that by realizing these differences, that it was important to actually constantly reflect innovations in order to be able to cohabitate. And it's really interesting that if you mentioned the GMO debate, that was very differently played out in different countries. We have a lifelong debate on nuclear energy, where Austria is profoundly against nuclear energy, and other countries like France are embracing nuclear energy very strongly. So we have to find a way of how to cohabitate while being different. And I think to ROI in that sense and social sciences have contributed a lot to kind of reflect these different cultures and these different backgrounds. And so we have found ourselves that maybe more than before, in order to avoid the difficulties we met with genetically modified organisms, there has been the effort to bring in social sciences and humanities at an earlier point in time. And more recently, even in innovation developments, there's a strong effort by the European Commission to use co-creation approaches. So to even bring people not only to assess technological developments, but to really bring them into the way of producing innovations. And in that sense, this is a very good possibility for the social sciences to really engage and beyond a single event where something has gone wrong already. And when we come back and say, oh, let's remember that, but really look forward to which kind of world do we want to live in? And how could science and technology kind of serve that goal in the best way? And that would be the ideal. But that also means for the social sciences and humanities that they have to engage in new ways across the borders with the scientific and technological developments. It is no longer possible to simply stay out and to just look at it from the outside. But there are more and more projects where social scientists are part of technological developments or part of scientific projects in order to continuously kind of reflect and influence also the development. And I think we need to, in that sense, to extend our vision, what problems are and what potential solutions are. And we have mentioned now climate crisis and many other things, but these are not only things that can be solved on a technological level. We need to find a socio-technical solution. So in a sense, like, how can we live a society with certain technological innovations? And we have to learn that technologies and innovations are both, they're maybe solutions, but they're also problems sometimes. And so we have to, as social scientists, maybe to navigate these borders and to kind of encourage engagement also within the scientific community.
Okay, thanks. So let us move to the sixth question, the role of public engagement. Professor Feld, RLI implies that societal actors such as researchers, citizens, policymakers, business, third sector organizations, etc., work together. So will you please explain about the role of public engagement?
Public engagement has been around as a notion for a while, but I think what is important, we have to understand the notion of engagement and take it seriously. It has to go beyond just listening to civil society actors or publics at large when it comes to assessing certain technology. This comes too late. And then we can go and say, let's remember that we should have done it better, but maybe it's important that engagement happens all along the development process, and this becomes, if you want so, a standard feature of producing knowledge and innovation. So it means shaping what the problem is and defining for whom is it a problem, and to look into potential solutions. And here we have to be more attentive to the fact for whom is it a solution. It means taking people's concerns, values, visions seriously and try to accommodate some of that when all along the process of developing knowledge and innovation. This means that as societies, we have to create time and space for thinking together about the futures we see worth attaining and how science and technology could contribute to this. And that means engagement means admitting novel viewpoints, listening to maybe quite radical critique, or take on board considerations that normally lie outside the taken for granted framing of a problem. So not the scientific frame alone is in that sense not enough. It's important, but not enough. And so engagement means for me creating the moments where the framing of the problem is carefully considered. It means looking out where different vulnerabilities lie and whether these people actually get voice in the process of innovation. So really speak to those that are could be potentially concerned, and balance the advantages and risks because they are uneven distributed. Social actors might bring broader sensibilities to the table where risks are higher and maybe the gain is not so high. And often we tend to create an idea of representing groups of people and then selecting representative voices. However, vulnerabilities are very, very differently distributed also across groups, and this is important. And finally, I think it's very important that through participation, we learn to know better that sense, which means that learn across different knowledge environments, so that science learns from society as much as society learns from science. And this is often limited by the way of how institutions, also like universities, frame what a good problem is, and if you can publish in high-end journals and things like that. And we need to carefully think about how we organize also the research system if we want to take participation seriously.
Thank you. So let us move on to the last question. What should we think when we consider about science and humanity? or humanities in the 21st century? This question is so important since new technology is always emerging. For example, AI, artificial intelligence, or quantum computing, and so on. So, Professor Yoshikawa, what should we think when we consider about science and humanity in 21st century?
As Professor Felt mentioned, in actuality, in terms of humanities and natural science, science is based on analytics. So analyzing the society, analyzing nature. Analyzing, of course, society is not easy because human behavior is not just a simple existence. So having said that, we need to respond to that. But how that could be done? So in fact, going back to the history once again, with the global warming in 1999, there was a Budapest meeting. And at the Budapest meeting, the scientists with UNESCO and scientific academy have joined together in this meeting. And there was a declaration, a statement, that importance of science and the importance of how science is good, use of scientific knowledge have been highlighted.
But there was no science about use of science. And this relates to the atomic bomb issue. So amongst the scientists, there was a deep reflection. Several tens of percent of scientists said that it's the people who use the technology who are to blame. But the Russell-Einstein declaration said differently. There's a responsibility of those who created it. So that was a starting point. And so the responsibility of use, that has been ignored since then. I think that's been a failure of humankind. So we have engineering. So I used to be in engineering. And before I was invited to the Budapest conference, and the president of the UK Academy and myself, we had a dialogue as heads of academy. Bruce Albert, a scientist, and I was an engineer. What's the role of the engineer? He asked, and I said. So I was seriously thinking about that. So I honestly, frankly told him, making things, and I want to create a theory for making things. And so when the knowledge is used, we would we can avoid making various mistakes, is what I said. And so from the output from the Budapest conference was fed into the UN, use of scientific knowledge. That concept was created, focus was on use of knowledge. I'm not perfectly satisfied with that, but the responsibility of use is the concept. And so we have to pursue then what does it mean to make something. And I say it's design. So we talk about analysis and design. So you analyze something. Design is using knowledge from the analysis to make things. So in design, we see a lot of deficiency. So personally, I had been researching that topic for years. And so in doing design, what I realized was that design is not just about natural science. It's directly related to human behavior and human happiness. And so that will be humanities, social science, in terms of the field of study. And as Professor Feld said, humanities and natural scientists, it has to be a good dialogue between them. So how to have that dialogue is not something that humankind has acquired. And the study of design, that is still a vacuum. Very few researchers. So we have to first establish the structure of that academic discipline. I think that's the responsibility of the scientists. And actual use, then the natural scientists and the humanities scientists have to have a good dialogue. And the humanities scientists, and then the users, not just to create something that can be used, but also you have to work with people who use that. So you need participation by the citizens. So participatory science is what comes out of that. So science, well, we have to reflect on the fact that science was divided, and we didn't think about the use, and so there were many things that we overlooked, and that has led to RRIs. So the starting point of all of that was is connected to the debate about the responsibility of the scientists for the atomic bomb. So I think it's our responsibility to continue to think about those issues.
Okay, thanks. Professor Felt, what should we think when we consider about science and humanity in 21st century in a short answer?
Yeah. Okay, so let me just, I think we are in a period of time when we are actually confronted as societies with these global challenges we mentioned already, like climate change, global health. We're in the midst of a pandemic, energy supply, food security. I could just endless. The UN development goals have summarized them for the first time really succinctly in that sense. So we live at a point in time where many of the questions are obviously linked to science and technological development. But we also have to see that science and technology are not only the solution, they are also part of a problem. And in that sense, and it's a continuous thing, it's not this radical one moment, it's not the explosion of the bomb. But if you think about, let me give you an example of environmental pollution with plastics, for example, to take a domain that touches every citizen in everyday context. When plastic entered the mass consumption realm after World War II, there was a huge fascination for all the capacities of this material. Nobody did think a second about what it means. And now we live in a society, we have now just passed in Europe the law for single-use plastics, the limitations. We have to think more carefully about that. And in that sense, I think the collaboration between the social sciences and humanities and the natural sciences is extremely important in the sense of not only remaining apart, but to integrate some of that thinking into the sciences and to kind of develop responsibility not as ex post gesture, that after you have invented something or done something, you start to reflect, but to think about responsibility as a way of reflecting what you do and to assess whether or not the possibility consequences. So I generally tend to say it's not about responsibility as such, but it's become response-able. So to develop as scientists the ability, the capacity to think about one's own research in terms of society. And here the collaboration between the fields is the big challenge. And institutions of science and development more generally, but in particular universities, would need to make that space in order to bring that into the minds and education of younger people. And I think there is space for improvement across the board. And I can speak from Europe, but I think this would be the case in many parts of the world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so the time is up. Let us close our session. Professor Yoshikawa and Professor Felt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Yoshikawa, Professor Felt, and Professor Fujigaki, thank you very much for that interesting and very important dialogue on science and humanity and for the responsibility of scientists. And Professor Fujigaki, congratulations on your very important and wonderful facilitation. Thank you very much. Well, history offers some significant lessons. We humans cannot focus only on creating a world for our own convenience. And our panel has made it clear that we share collective responsibility to build a peaceful and sustainable society. So we'd like to thank our panel again.